people down.
Oh, and looks like James has already put us on YouTube Live. We can also catch up offline later.
Edit it out. This is all very, very relaxed.
Yeah. It's like, oh, a couple of old friends talking about their current situation.
I was trying to think about when I had actually met you or started working with you, because I know I left Hackbright in 2018, and I know you were pretty involved for a while. So yeah, I can't remember.
Yeah, it would have been pretty early on. I want to say maybe 15.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe
because I joined in 2016.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So after that. But I remember for a while, you were in, I remember walking in and you were in the office every single time. And eventually we got to chatting and there this is.
Yeah.
So.
And I love when parts of my work life can kind of collaborate and combine. So.
Absolutely.
Looks like we still got a few more people joining in.
Wow.
Everybody.
This is a heck of a crowd. Look at that.
A crowd, yeah, but you can see the names and a couple faces.
Yeah. I like being able to see people's faces, even if they're only half listening, personally.
Thank you, Levy and Yara.
Hey everyone.
Hello.
And Joe. Mike, this is Joe as well. Joe's on the Xoogler School team.
Thanks for coming, Mike. Appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Pay it forward, yeah.
Looks like our numbers are starting to settle in a little bit. So yeah, I guess, I do want to be mindful of time, so we could just get started and I can do a quick intro. So hi, everybody. Happy Wednesday or, Thursday if you're in other parts of the world. I'm really excited because today we're joined by a former colleague of mine, Mike Omoto. So he and I know each other when I worked at Hackbright Academy, which is a coding school for women, which is based in San Francisco. Mike was really involved as a mentor for our students, also as a guest speaker. And then eventually he became an instructor part-time for our intro to programming course or a prep course. So it's been really fun to get to stay in touch with him over the last few years. And so when I was thinking about other Xoogler School guests, I thought Mike would be a great person to bring in, given his experience already wanting to give back to different students in their career transitions, and also because he has such a unique background. So I'll let Mike introduce himself and kind of dive into what that means and what that looks like. So Mike, yeah, if you want to, do you want to share your screen or do you want me to share?
I can share, or I can try to share. Let's see how this works. Nope, not that one. 3. All right. And I have to open system preferences and security and privacy to share screen. Wow, I should have definitely tried this sooner.
So while you're doing that,
why don't you do that?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I think I have to leave Zoom and come back. So I'll just say next and you hit next, and I'm sorry.
No worries at all.
All right. So while we get started on the slides, first and foremost, I'd like to apologize if I sound like I just woke up, because I literally did. I'm coming out of Tokyo, way from you, from the far East Coast. It's 7:50 a.m. And usually I wake up at around 7 o'clock to get my morning coffee and things like that. But I roll out of bed around 7:15, which puts me about 15 minutes behind schedule. But this is 20 minutes earlier than I usually talk to anybody. But I love chatting with people, and I love hearing all kinds of interesting stories. And so I thought I'd swing by today to present my own my own little life experience for however valuable that may be. All right. So
Can you see that all right?
yeah, I can see that. All right. So first and foremost, yes, I work for Google. Opinions are my own. Have to get that bit of legalese out there before proceeding, because Google's lawyer is just really good, and I'm not one of the careers that I did not do was law. So I'm definitely gonna stick to the policy on this one. So generally speaking, when people think of bilingualism, they think of language, right? Like, oh, I speak multiple languages, and yeah, that's a useful way of thinking about it. But there's also different ways of thinking about bilingualism, and being really like in between multiple cultures or in between multiple spaces, right? So this my career has sort of experienced bilingualism in a couple of different ways, and I definitely want to highlight that as I go through. But in order to sort of highlight that, I sort of need to walk through my career and talk a little bit about the decisions that I made and why I made them. Next slide, please. So first, I'm going to go through a little bit of, I guess, like what I consider my work history. Next slide. Who knows what that stuff on the bottom is? Like, who can like just type it in chat or scream it out loud, or like scream at your computer screen like people occasionally do?
Polymers?
This is a
Neurons?
what was that? Yes. This is an image of neurons. And so I was lucky enough, as my first job out of school, like, so I graduated a degree in cognitive science, and like a little, like I was interested in biology, but I basically failed on my biology classes. But I was lucky enough coming out of my undergrad with to an actual job and not an internship, at a place at the Department of Veterans Affairs. They had a neuroscience lab in Los Angeles. And so literally I was like underneath a fume hood pipetting, right? Like looking at under a microscope. This is actually not an image that I took, but literally I took, I did fluoroscopy, and I did similar experiments which generated these kinds of images. And so it's like, oh my gosh, like I had basically failed. Yeah, I'd basically failed out of a biology degree into a psych degree. And I was like, okay. And then all of a sudden I'm working in this bio lab. And so it's like, oh my gosh, this is actually kind of fun. Should I try to be a biologist? Like, man, how do I do that? I need to go get my PhD. Spoiler alert, that did not happen. What actually happened was I spent a little time in the lab, about a year and a half, and then went into the administration wing of the same institution to try to figure out, like, ooh, if I want to get a PhD, I need to learn about grant writing and things like that. And so being in the administration wing also kind of helped, probably also helps. And so I'm going to go attempt that for a little bit. But as it turns out, working in research administration is like the most boring thing in the world. Like, you can't even believe how boring it is. Reading, like, I don't know, people would submit papers, and there are 4 papers, and they're like almost exactly the same paper with just like one variable tweaked, and I have to figure out whether or not that extra tweak requires, like, this kind of oversight or that kind of oversight. Oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe. So that did not happen. Next slide, please. After that, I got really tired of sort of like the academic life, and I was like, oh gosh, what can I possibly do? What can I possibly do that would be as far away from this as possible, basically? And so I was like, well, I've got a psych degree. Maybe I should think about putting that to a little bit of use. And so I went into a field called cognitive behavioral therapy. This is basically a glorified special needs teacher. And so I was working with autistic kids, making sure, like, in schools, and making sure that they were behaving well, and getting the training and the specific training that they needed, to sort of like not act out in classroom settings and things like that. And it was hard and rewarding. It was like, and then I had a manager, or really like a field advisor, and they had a master's degree in this. And I was like, oh, that sounds like an interesting thing. Maybe I should go get a degree in that. Spoiler alert, that did not happen. It was, like I realized after a little bit that while I'm a relatively patient person, that working in like hardcore and special ed, especially for a couple of years, eventually sort of started wearing on my consciousness. And so I definitely wanted to sort of step away from that space. On the other hand, I really did like teaching. So what I ended up doing, and this is sort of like where you start to see the thought process behind like working at a startup too, but I kind of wanted to see what it was like to be a teacher as quickly as possible without committing to like a 2-year degree in education. And so I realized that you can go teach in Japan, and that's like teaching in Japan only requires a college degree, and I have one of those, sweet. But I ended up really loving teaching, and because my MVP was so good, I actually ended up teaching Japanese for 4 years. On my way there, I studied a lot of Japanese. Like I'm Japanese American, so I have like a cultural reason to study Japanese. And so like my parents speak Japanese, and that was really great. And so, writing a letter for them the first time, I remember my dad, I came home 4 years later, the letter that I wrote him 3.5 years ago, the first one I scrawled out in my terrible Japanese handwriting, was pinned up on the fridge like I was like a 6-year-old child. And that was really adorable. But coming from my psych background, I thought to myself, gosh, I really love academia actually, and I really kind of want to explore that space a little bit. And I still have my psych degree, and now I know enough about Japanese. I applied, especially when learning Japanese, I applied my psych knowledge as much as possible to become fluent, and I'm actually very, very fluent. I'm close to native. So, based on that experience, maybe I should go get a psycholinguistics degree, and I decided to go back to the United States. The spoiler alert there is that did not happen either. Next slide, please. When I came back to the States, I went looking for basically part-time jobs because I wanted to study to get to pass my the GREs, right? And one of the jobs the job that I took was basically a part-time job as a consumer scientist tech. And what a consumer scientist does, a consumer scientist is the intersection of psychology and marketing. Does this soap smell soapy? Does it make you feel clean, right? We do qualitative / quantitative analysis on individual content. Like we send out essentially reviews and get people to rate them on different scales to try to figure out like what the best formulation of scent might be for a particular type. Does this scent fit with the brand profile, right? I think I once told Jen that I know more about makeup than any dude on the planet. Probably not 100% true, but it's kind of a fun thing to talk about. But it was actually really entertaining, right? Like actually doing, getting back to science without necessarily being under a fume hood, and working as a researcher in industry was actually really entertaining. And my manager had a master's degree in consumer science from UC Davis. And I was like, hey, that's kind of entertaining. Maybe I should go do that. Yeah, well, spoiler, that didn't happen either, but next slide, please. So one of the things my manager did, or one of the things that my team did, was we sent out these bottles of product, and along with it, we sent basically a survey, and we would receive this survey and parse the text for the kind of language that people use to describe categories of product. For example, when a person describes a canonical lotion or a sunscreen or a shampoo, what kind of language do they tend to use when they like it, right? So we would associate the positive attributes with the language they use to describe those positive attributes. And then we would basically use that, send it to the marketing team, and use the copy that the consumers generated to sell lotion back to the consumers. Really, really wonderful concept. And so I pointed out to my boss, that's like, hey, look, on Amazon, people do this for free. And she laughed for a little bit, but the very next day she came back with a list of about 500 products from all across the consumer space, and told me to copy and paste all those reviews into a spreadsheet. Now, if you've been paying attention, I tend not to like boring things. And this is like the boringest of the boring thing. I was like, oh my gosh, I got out of academia to get away from this kind of thing. And it's like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. What can I do? All right, next slide, please. So the conscientious around you know that programming is a really great way to tackle these programs. I learned to code because it saved me time. It turned boring time into interesting time, where instead of spending 2 weeks copy, paste, click, 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 copy, paste, click, 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 ad nauseum, instead of doing that, I could like spend a little time like figuring out puzzles or figuring out what the right like XML selectors to, push through like the website are. This is actually still on my GitHub today if you're interested in taking a peek. But long story short, this was like a lot of fun. And I basically learned to program this thing from scratch. So inside of 2 weeks, completely on my own, by the sheer virtue of force of will to avoid having to do this incredibly menial task, I somehow succeeded in building a web scraper that pulled reviews from not just Amazon, but really every single review site out there. All right, next slide, please. So, yeah. So when I did this, one of the things I like, this was a real program. They had classes and inheritance and other, design patterny type things. These were things that I had never really read before, or I hadn't read the Gang of Four book, and I hadn't like figured out for myself that these were useful patterns. But as it turned out, it was like relatively well designed. And I'm still not 100% sure why that is. I maintain that basically what had happened was that people yelling at me on Stack Overflow has sort of shaped my design into a halfway decent one. And so basically it's like trial by fire by putting my thoughts on the internet and just getting shouted down so hard that it struck the fear of God and fear of programming into me. But still, my motivation to actually code this thing to avoid the horrendously menial task was still high enough that I somehow overcame that challenge. It was a terrible learn to program experience. And so eventually there was a giant lawsuit at Johnson & Johnson, like a recall, and they lost a whole bunch of money. So they spent a whole bunch of time restructuring, which means that my boss's boss were all let go, and me, the lowly, like tech who was on contract and they couldn't get rid of me for another 6 months, was reporting directly to the senior VP of Consumer Science North America. Great, this person literally had no idea who I was. So I was just like spinning my wheels. I spent all that time learning to program on the job, doing my daily job duties. I still had some, but also spending like 40 hours a week at home. My wife bringing me food at my desk and things like that. Jen, with Hackbright, can recount a similar experience for most of the students who actually study programming there. But at, about 6 months in, I saw this advertisement on Stack Overflow, and I was like, if you can solve this programming challenge, your resume goes to the top of the stack. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. Maybe I have a shot. And so I submitted an interview, and I could barely program. Like, I was 6 months in, I had nobody to teach me. I was scared. It's really hard to solve these challenges. These are all like math challenges, but they're also kind of interesting. But it was terrifying, right? It's like how do I know that I'm even remotely qualified to do this? Next slide, please. So the spoiler alert here is that this went like really well, like beyond my wildest dreams well. I was the only person there without a CS degree. I started when there were only 4 engineers at this place. And, when you are 28 and everybody else around you is like 25 and 22, 23, 24, 25, and they've had like 7 or 8 year long careers in programming up until then already, you have to, or it feels like you have to catch up. And so I threw myself at it with a religious fervor and learned everything I could about programming, became an actually objectively good programmer, eventually taking over for the tech lead, becoming a manager, and then becoming a director of engineering. I'd been programming for about 3 years, maybe, before becoming a director of engineering. This is a Y Combinator startup for those who are familiar with the space. At the time, it was about worth $100 million-ish with about 30 engineers. So going from like a 4 engineer team to a 30 engineer team, going from like maybe 20 million valuation to 100+ million valuation, and then watching my career go from like basically being, Shakespeare's monkey on the programmer, on the coding side, to actually being a director of engineering and knowing how all this stuff works. Like, that went crazy well. I finally found something that I was good at, that valued my work, and I was 30 years old. Next slide, please. So another 3 years went by. So I was actually director of engineering at Presto, the company, for 3 years. And I wanted to maintain a new set of challenges. The first challenge was I had worked at like a big company. I worked at Johnson & Johnson, so I sort of knew what that was like. And I worked at like a tiny company. And then I also kind of worked at sort of like a smaller mid-sized company, right? My previous company, Presto, had gone from like a tiny company to like a mid-sized company. Went from being in a house in Palo Alto to like actually being an office in Redwood City. And so I've seen that growth. But I've not really been at like a unicorn stage company. I was like, okay, so I think I'm ready to, graduate and sort of see what's out there in the world. And my CEO had a really nice coffee chat with me where he sat me down and was like, look, I figured it's the time. He was really cool about it. Anyway, but I decided to work at a unicorn. And I approached this pretty methodically, like I seem to do. And I went through the list of unicorns and Googled each one and figured out which products I really liked. But just randomly at the last minute, I got introduced to this company called Mercury. And as it turns out, they were the first Japanese unicorn. And being the first is pretty meaningful, actually. It means that they get to set the stage for a lot of what happens in Tokyo Tech. And if you've been following the Tokyo technical scene, Japan doesn't produce many unicorns. Japan has fewer unicorns than, say, like Brazil, right? Which is kind of like, I'm a Japanese American person. I have a bit of pride in the space, but that's kind of embarrassing, actually, if you're the second, at the time, the second and maybe the third biggest economy in the world. Like Japan is known for its technical marvel and innovation, and why are there so few unicorns out there? And so I decided to try for this, and this was a really good fit for me because I had spent a whole bunch of time learning to speak Japanese. Obviously, me being Japanese American means I have Japanese cultural roots, which I also sort of folded into being a manager in Silicon Valley. And so, this would mean that they're hiring this manager from Silicon Valley with Japanese roots. I was actually the first English-speaking engineering manager there. Also along the way, I failed the Facebook interview for the second time. So like I'd been doing interviewing off and off, but this is like, even for big companies, I'm sure I had my failures. I got on the backstory here too. I also was reached out to by Google at around this time for the first time, but I wasn't really interested in working for them just yet because it was like a I don't know, like a cloud compute position, and I just wasn't interested in what they were doing. Anyway, next slide, please. So here's what I did at Mercury. So Mercury was growing at a really rapid clip. And so they were putting on like 40 new grads every 6 months or so and trying to become a quote unquote global company to whatever that means. And 40 new grads every 6 months is a lot. When I joined the team, there were about 100 engineers, and there were about 10 of them spoke English professionally. If you think of things in those terms, like putting on 40 new grads every month, if you had 40 people join with 10 people who can actually communicate with them, maybe, and only like 3 of them who are senior, that is a recipe for disaster. And so I recognized that immediately and was like, okay, and then spun up the hiring pipeline for foreign engineers and basically ran this operation over a year and a half that took us from a 10% English-speaking engineering team to a 50% English-speaking engineering team. At the time, by the time I was done, we had something like 500 or 600 engineers, with like 200 of them or so speaking English. So, directly responsible for hiring like 150 people from outside of Tokyo and pulling them into Japan, and then really sort of like pushing the boundaries on what it means for a Japanese company to be a Silicon Valley sort of copycat. Anyway, on the product side, I was also an engineering manager there, so I was responsible for payments and shipping of the US app. Also, not really a small component in and of itself. Pretty decent space. So I had a good time there. Anyway, so I was there for about a year and a half. When, next slide, please, I was finally approached by Google. Working at Mercury, I ran the Tokyo tech scene is very small, right? And there's not actually like enough events. Like working in Silicon Valley, you can't walk down the street without stumbling across something to attend, right? It's like, oh, this is it's a Facebook event. Oh, it's a Twitter event. Anyway, so that wasn't the case in Tokyo. And so I set it out to make part of that a reality, like, and to, because when an English speaking engineer comes to Tokyo, this is one of the things that they want in order to sort of support the ecosystem here, right? And so I was running these events. One of them was called Global Engineers Meetup, and the other was in conjunction with Women Who Code. And a talent outreach program from Google came to the event that I was running. Actually, what happened was we were in the same building, and so we were in the same lobby, and so we had a chance to talk. And she's like, "Oh yeah, we're having an event with Google Maps." And I was like, "Oh, that sounds cool." And I wasn't that interested, but yeah, it's like, "You should come to our events." Like, "Yeah, we'll come to yours, and you can come to ours." I'm like, "All right, that seems fair." And so I went. As it turns out, the section of Google Maps that they were hiring for was a section called UGC. UGC is user-generated content, which is actually kind of in line with a lot of my psych research interests, if you think about it in those terms, right? And so it's I had this chat at the event. I had this chat with an engineering manager there, and they were talking about like what kind of metrics they use to like actually figure out how people like their product. And I was going back and forth with them and making suggestions like, "Hey, you don't already work here, do you?" I was like, "No." It's like, and he looked at me like, "Really? You should totally work here." This is exactly the kind of thought process we need. If we go back to like my consumer science background and all the way back to my stats and psych, like it's exact like the knowledge that I had working from in those kinds of worlds definitely, corroborated with the kind of engineering that they were working with there. And so I interviewed and I actually somehow made it in through sheer force of will and probably a lot of luck. All right. Next slide, please. All right, so long story short, like my career has been full of twists and turns and nicks and crannies, and there's a couple of sections, there's a couple of like dimensions of bilingualism that I sort of want to point out. Obviously, like the language is one of them, but so we'll go over each of them in turn and talk about how they, and I'll try to explain a little bit how they influence my career and influence sort of my thinking. Next slide, please. So first was actually just the plain old bilingualism, right? Being able to speak Japanese and essentially teaching myself Japanese. Like I had a good reason to teach myself Japanese, but I also know a lot of people who don't, and they do very well. But it definitely opened the door to Mercury. It made me kind of their unicorn, right? Like there weren't any engineering managers in Silicon Valley who spoke fluent Japanese and also knew like about the systems that they were directly hiring for. Like this convergence of multiple elements of value, right, really added to I guess like my flavor profile for whatever they were whatever they had an appetite for, right? And so it allowed me to join that company and make a really huge impact in a pretty short period of time. It aged me a bit, but that's also the thing. But there's also like a number of interesting career options, right? Like I have friends who are sort of working in this like bilingual space, who are really interested in sort of tapping what I know and how I sort of like walk throughout the world to sort of change the way that they are working with their companies, especially around like hiring or other international companies who need like managers working overseas. The companies like Sony. I have a friend who was the this is going to sound weird. He was the CEO of Sony America for like 10 years back in the 70s. And I spent a bunch of time, like he's one of my mentors, and I spent a bunch of time talking to him about my career. And when I told him I was thinking about leaving Mercury, he was like, "Oh yeah, let me go talk to this VP of Sony. And like, we need people who are basically like fully bilingual to manage that system. And I'm sure there's like a technology position available for you." And I was like, "Whoa, okay." Anyway, so there's a lot of interesting career options that exist if you have like language skills, right? Next slide. One of the things that I strongly believe is that like technical bilingualism is going to become overwhelmingly useful in the future, right? Working at Google Maps is great for me because of my consumer science plus engineering background. The next big biomedical startup or healthcare startup isn't going to be some kid at Harvard CS tapping away like Zuckerberg did in the night. It's going to be someone at Harvard Med, right? It's going to be the people who have experienced the difficulties in that space firsthand instead of trying to communicate that to an engineer, because it is so much easier than ever, right, to learn how to be a programmer. And so like this is sort of where my head's at. Like for me, I definitely developed my career on the back of being a more communicative engineer and being like more thoughtful about product and the business side than just about the programming. That definitely helped out when I got promoted to director. So a little story behind that. What happened was my company had a down round. And in Silicon Valley, that means that down rounds mean that your investors are very, very upset with you because they just lost a ton of money. In fact, our investor was actually trying to actively divest from the company, which is not a good sign. But in order to prevent us from doing that, or in order to prevent doing that, we agreed to have a round of layoffs. And so these layoffs happened, and like my director at the time was not a real human being, and so he did not spend like a whole bunch of time with each person making sure that they're okay. Like it was me and the HR person who did things like reach out to our industry contacts to try to get people jobs. He did not sit down with every person one-on-one. Ultimately, that was me who did that. And after the layoffs happened, he bounced, and I was like, okay, so I'm sort of stuck holding the ends of this rope. And so getting together with all the people, making sure that the team is still okay, setting up one-on-ones with everybody, making sure that they're doing well, how you feeling, just doing stuff, not because like they needed a manager or anything, but because like they needed to talk to people at work. Anyway, so things of that sort, like when it came time to be like, hey, who should be director of engineering? Like we kind of need one now. And then, basically everybody looked around the room and it's like, I mean, it's Mike, right? And I was like, okay. Actually, and so like that entire space, right, was like very much handled because I was not, how can I put this? I was a personable engineer, as opposed to a person who really only cared about metrics and code. And the human side of engineering was something that I cared a lot about. And even when I was working in a product space for that, like the human side of the way that we approached what we were building, right, was definitely influenced by my psych background. Other things that I was able to do is I was able to do business development because I was the only person who sort of spoke Japanese when Japanese investors came along. It's like, hey, do you want to expand in Japan? My CEO was like, yes, Mike, you're up to bat. Good luck. And I was like, oh shit, it has officially hit the fan. What do I do? And so I got to experience this world of business development for a little bit. Fly out to Japan, meet the CEOs of some really big companies, some really fantastic restaurants, some of which I still eat today. One of which is right down the street from me, which is actually really cool. But like hearing about how to do that was like really, really useful. At Mercury, this helped me in the sense that like when I had to go argue for budget and allocation, I had some very passionate people working for me, right? And they were interested in things like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and things like that, but they had no idea how to argue for that budget. In Japan, when you say women in tech, they're like, why do we need that? Here's our woman in tech, singular. It's ridiculous. And so I was like, no, that's not enough. You need to go do these things. You need to go do these events, go sponsorships. And so arguing for that budget and allocation took, took twice, like 10 times the effort as like it normally would in the Valley, right? But at the same time, it's like I have these people working for me who are like hankering to go get money and try to figure out how to do that, but like have no idea how to do that. And so definitely my experience as an actual director and like talking about thinking through budget and allocation and knowing how to like properly de-risk investments and like figuring out what ROI looks like and figuring out like how this affects the candidate pipeline and being able to put that down on paper really, really helped, right? So being able to having a combination of like product/business sense and understanding the tech side, right, are both really critical aspects to that part of my career. All right, next slide, please. And then finally, obviously, the software and psychology standpoint. UGC, like I wouldn't have had that job. Actually, no. Yeah, that's true. I wouldn't have had that job, but I also wouldn't have been interested in doing this job right? If it wasn't for my psychology background. Obviously, being a programming instructor, as I was at Hackbright, having the psych background and having the teaching background was instrumental. Like, I don't know if you guys can tell, but I'm pretty comfortable in front of people, even though they're completely silent on a Zoom call. I pretend in my head that if this was in a public space and you guys were sitting in front of me, at least some of these jokes would be landing. That's I don't know how naive that is, but yeah, and things like that. But also, like, one of the things that I want everybody to know is that being a good engineering manager also takes a lot of psychology. This is sort of a subtle jab at engineers, but definitely working with as a behavioral therapist with autistic children helped me manage engineers better. For better or for worse. I love everybody I work with. I'm gonna put that out there, but definitely like understanding like what motivation, like how to break down motivation, having a library of techniques and quotes and just like broad spectrum advice in my head to just counter as many situations as possible has really helped me be as good an engineering manager as I can be. I hope my reports will agree. Anyway, so those are the three types of bilingualism that I've sort of advocated for and sort of incorporated in my own life. I want, as a personal exercise, like, go through your own individual experiences and figure out like where that combined value comes from, right? Because like there's ways to provide value. Like I see kids coming out of school, right, and they're like, what is your value? It's like, oh, I can code. Great. 100,000 other people are graduating right now all across the world who can do exactly that. What is your value? How are you going to change it? And sometimes they have an answer and sometimes they don't, right? The best ones definitely have some idea that they are different from like how they add value, right? So they can, they either have a plan in their head 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, how they want to evolve. And sort of like me, it's not really about whether that plan is successful, right? The best made plans. What's the phrase? Plans are useless. Planning is everything, right? And so even the best made plans are completely going to go to waste. And if you grade me based on like, if you went through the listed plans that I made, like OKRs, and graded me on all of them, I would be just a massive failure, like just all the way down the line. But on the flip side, like, it's come to this point where all that set of experiences has really folded themselves well into the, custard set as Mike Omoto. And I hope that, that diversity, like within a single, canister, has helped me make a meaningful impact on the world around me. And I hope that everybody can also figure out what kind of diversity not only can you have, like, not only can you have on the world around you, but what kind of diversity you can sort of like implement in yourself to sort of execute on like impact at a larger scale for your own careers. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. I would love to answer questions for like ever.
All right, I'm going to stop the screen share. We can definitely spend the rest of our time together with some Q&A. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and put some things in our dory and let's see what's in there. All right, so first question for you, Mike. I'm a gap year student trying to learn computer science and programming on the side, but struggle with consistency. How do I keep at it every day? And do you have any tips when it comes to self-learning?
Wow. Consistency is key. Like I was motivated because coming from like, and this is going to be like almost annoyingly honest. I had like just gotten married, and psych doesn't pay well. Psych pays like, I don't know, I had maybe 30K a year in Los Angeles, and that was not good. So moving to Silicon Valley, like it straight up doubled my income, and I was like, okay, if I don't do this, like I don't I can't support my family. So it was existential for me. Yeah, like, and I, I see a lot of it. Like when I studied Japanese, right? That was existential for me. Like I either learn this or I go home crying, right? I don't really like the struggle with motivation, at a certain point, and this is like how to make it, is it important enough for you, right? Like have you put enough on the line? For me, like those are the biggest motivations, but I really think that like motivations are different for each person. And in order to figure out how to pick up new things successfully, you have to figure out where that motivation is. For me, it's clearly throwing myself into a new situation, lighting my toes on fire and dancing. Like that is how I pick up new skills. Otherwise, I don't do it. Like otherwise, I'm terribly motivated. I have, I really need like the fire to my feet to do it. And so for you personally, it's like I don't know who asked this question, and I don't know you personally, but figuring out like what your motivation, like what motivates you, and like learning how to learn, right, that first time. And you could use programming as the first thing that you learn how to learn, and in the future you could pick up other things like business development, management, or whatever, piano playing, folding paper cranes. But it's like that learning how to learn thing that I think people really struggle with. That you need to understand what that meta process of learning is before like thinking about programming specifically as a skill.
Great, thanks, Mike.
Thank you for the question.
Question from Iris: what advice do you have for a Chinese Canadian to leverage the bilingualism edge? How did you decide to move back to Tokyo versus staying in the US? I have a similar dilemma in that I'm deciding whether to work in China or stay in North America.
Really cool question. I don't know if you know this, but there are Chinese people everywhere. Like they're everywhere, not just in China. Let me give you an example. Who's familiar with Peruvian food? That's a weird question. Who knows what lomo saltado is?
I'm Peruvian. So Letitia.
That's Peruvian food. Yeah,
I'm
like
sure.
so if you hey, so you love lomo saltado. So lomo saltado
Yeah, the
is
vegetarian version.
Yeah, that's if you go to Peru, that's considered chufa. It's literally Chinese food because it was brought there by Chinese people. Like the sauces were brought there by Chinese people like 150 years ago as manual labor. Like there are Chinese people everywhere. You don't have to go to China to like leverage your bilingualism. Actually, even in Japan, there are Chinese companies trying to come to Japan, right? That need to leverage bilingualism. So you don't need to move to China to try to leverage that bilingualism. It's one of the places where, obviously there are more Chinese people in China than there are anywhere else in the world. But like I've made, the reason I know about the Chinese thing in Peru is like I've actually been to Peru and like worked with some of the Peruvian Nikkei, Peruvian Japanese, on some of the social issues that they were working with, leveraging my Japanese skills to help connect Peruvian Japanese people to Japan, right? And so like, there are yes, Lima's awesome. There are edges to this graph everywhere. How did I decide to move to Tokyo? Well, I mean, Mercury was here and that was sort of a thing. My wife's also Japanese, and like I'm living, this is a space that I read from my wife's parents. Actually, they live next door. And so just being close to family and things like that. So there were a lot of personal reasons, but there wasn't any specific reason I needed to move to Tokyo. I mean, I lived away from my family while I was in the Bay. I'm originally from Los Angeles, and companies that I thought about working at, like were in Amsterdam, London, South America, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore. Like, I recommend getting out.
Okay, awesome. So let's see. From Alina, as a double major in cognitive science with a focus in linguistics and computer science, what advice do you have for me to expand technical bilingualism? I'm interested in the computational linguistics area, but how can I explore more CS plus something fields?
Sweet. That's awesome. You're exactly like me. That's first off, that's awesome. So cognitive science and CS, the combination of them is typically like in like human computer interaction type fields. There's a master's human computer interaction. People that I've seen come out of those master's programs have done really, really well. Computational linguistics is hard and new. There is a lot around, there's like a lot around like how machines are generating new languages. Actually, in Tokyo, in the Google office, there's like a group of people who are working on the Japanese NLP parser, plus some other things. And so there's like this entire space around it. It's really easy to dip your toes into. Like if you remember, the first project I literally did as a programmer was in the NLP, like computational linguistics space, where I busted out a tokenizer, figured out what all the adjectives that people were using, figuring out what the sentiments for those adjectives were. Like this was all part of that project. That being said, like things have evolved in like the last 10 years, and so things are going to be a little bit more advanced now than they were when I started. So sort of to that end, like the bar is higher. I would definitely recommend, if you're interested in this, like and want to go into that specific field, I would definitely recommend getting a secondary degree and trying to figure out like what the expertise in there looks like. It's a pretty tricky road to traverse by yourself these days. On the other hand, it's not impossible. Like if you really want to do it, getting a job like in and around that space and like approaching. Actually, so I'm gonna go on a tangent here. A lot of the career changes I made, I was lucky to some degree, but it wasn't entirely luck, right? Like I sort of pointed myself in a direction and put myself in a situation which kind of made me lucky. And this is one of those things where, like if you're really interested in computational linguistics, being in and around that space will give you a better odds at getting lucky on your own, right? And that's like, generally speaking, like that's really the best you can do. You can sort of like go do everything that you can to sort of be in that space and, like cheer for yourself if you hit one.
All right, thanks, Mike. So a question from Jacob. Interested to hear about what kinds of people you were looking for when recruiting them to work in Japan for Mercury. Was language an important factor? Talent in the workplace? Determination to work for Mercury?
Okay, so if you are from the United States, you probably don't know what Mercury is. That's a straight up reality. Even if you do know what it is, like it's not a, what the US version is, and you don't know how big a deal the Japan one is. Let me put it this way, in the United States, people are hankering to go work at Google. In Japan, people are hankering to go work at Mercury. It's the top Japanese tech company, straight up. That means the motivation for people to come who are interested in coming to Japan usually aren't that interested in working at Mercury. They're interested in working in Japan. So that does sort of go into a factor, but that's also an inescapable reality, right? You can't really like be 100% picky. What you can do is you can make the environment as welcoming as possible, invite them, and hope that some percentage of them stay. And that's sort of like the approach that I took. Now, the hardest thing about moving to Japan is the fact that you're not moving to Mercury, but it's the fact that you're moving to Japan. It's not like moving to the UK or Canada. Like it's a completely different language. You will have to, like you have to expect that, especially if you're like a mid-career person, the experience that you've had and the rate of like knowledge acquisition that you were used to is going to be handicapped. I kind of equate it to feeling like dumber all the time. So you work in a Japanese company, you have to sort of be, and this is a hit. This is like an ego thing too. But you kind of have to be okay with feeling dumber all the time, and that's what you have to look out for, right? Like if there are people, like if you interview someone and they have an ego about what it is that they're doing, right? If they're like, oh, what did you do? It's like, oh, I'm the awesomest awesome. I'm like elite hacker. I'm like a code ninja. And like they talk about themselves as if they're, like a marketing professional. What ends up happening is they're going to hit walls here that they cannot climb over. You have to be willing to work with, like, half the company is still Japanese. You have to be willing to work with them, and be willing to cross like what that chasm looks like as best as possible without becoming a Japanese person. And that's actually like the other half of it. It's like you have enough of an identity where you're not going to be, like absorbed into the Japanese stack and just become as Japanese as possible to get your point across, because that's also not healthy for the company. Like they're trying to diversify, right? That's actually the primary criticism of hiring 40 fresh grads, is that if you hire 40 fresh grads with only 10 other English-speaking engineers, what's going to happen is that those 40 fresh grads are going to become close facsimiles of Japanese people, right? And so basically getting non-Japanese people in there as quickly as possible to properly globalify the environment, right, is like the only sensible move. Anyway, so yeah, it's kind of a subtle and like tricky distinction. So it's like not really determination. It's like how trying to figure out like how people will sort of fit into this without trying to become too Japanese and still maintaining a sense of identity. Like we're I don't know, to put it in slightly more politically incorrect terms, we are hiring for diversity because frankly Japan is a monoculture, right?
All right, thanks, Mike. I know a few students have also mentioned to me that they're interested in working abroad one day. So I guess I'm curious, kind of to follow up with that question too, if there's anything you can share for advice for students who are wanting to venture to other countries for their future careers.
Okay, so there's a couple of really strong countries that have like really strong tech that also pay decently well. And for me, those are the three principal ones. One is Japan. Obviously, Japan for local Japanese engineers, the pay is pretty horrible. But for foreigners from overseas, if you manage to get into one of the top tier tech companies, it's usually around 70% roughly of what you make in the Bay, which is pretty good. So if you're making 100K in the Bay, you'll be making about 70K in Japan. To put things into perspective, that's also about what you'd make in like, Georgia or Ohio. So like a decent, it's still a decent chunk of money. Comparatively, if you want to work in say like India or China, it'd be like 20 to 30% of what you'd be making in the Bay. Which means that leaving, like once you get there, leaving becomes much, much harder, right? Anyway, so I would say that that's sort of like the minimum bar, right? Like all of you have probably college loans to pay off. Making 20K in India or like 35K in China probably is not particularly tenable. So Japan, Singapore, like a bunch of countries in Europe, Amsterdam sticks out, London. It's sort of kind of up to you. But I would definitely, and the key thing is to make one of them your home base. Now, once you've chosen a country, there are a whole bunch of ways to get there. Like those countries have companies that are hiring all the time. Tokyo has hiring events. There's something called the, what was it? like Japan Career Forum or something to that effect. I don't remember the exact name, but there's a biannual event that happens in San Francisco. This is actually where I met Mercury, where a whole bunch of Japanese companies will come in and try to hire fresh grads from the United States, and they'll pay them decently well. Google will attempt, if you make it to Google and are interested in a position in Japan, they can actually match you with a team here. I actually have done that. Like one of the especially coming from China, like I have a bunch of people who I've hired recently who are essentially fresh grads, and I had an L3, which is an entry-level software engineer from Minnesota, of all places, who's actually stuck there because we hired her before COVID, then COVID hit, and now Japan has closed its borders. So, it's entirely like, understanding like what your avenues are and doing your research as to what companies are in that locale will take you a long way. Interestingly, I wasn't planning on working in Japan. Like I was planning on working for a unicorn in the States. And so like I was applying to like Uber and like, Airbnb and like Open Door and companies like that. And I got a couple of those. It was really interesting working for them. But, for me, like maximizing my value between like the engineering side and the Japanese side, I figured I would be a bigger influence on Mercury than say on like Open Door.
Great. I know we got 4 minutes left, so let's see if we can squeeze in a few more. Question from Yara. This is a great one because I know we pivoted our topic for your talk today. Her question is, would you be able to give some tips on how to answer technical questions during interviews?
Okay, so there's a playbook, right? There's like those are who like in psych, there's this thing called scripting, and a scripting is like, you go to a restaurant and you sit down and there's like a script between you and the waitress or waiter that goes back and forth. There's like a well-known thing. Interviewing is that. And do you remember the first time, like the very, very first time that you went to a restaurant by yourself? And do you remember if you were able to like spit out your order correctly, or if you're able to like do the interaction right, especially if you've never seen it before, right? And I'd be willing to bet that you messed something up about it. Like there was some element that experience that didn't go well, or that the waitress didn't quite understand. And maybe you left like a tip that was a little bit too big or too small, and whatever. Like there's some element of that did not go well. Interviewing, that's all interviewing is. It's being familiar with the process, doing enough of them, getting it into your head. It's going to the same restaurants a bunch of times. There's a certain amount of luck involved. Like my Google interview was an algorithm that I had basically, the solution was something that I had done something similar to. And I got lucky. As an engineering manager, we get 2 technical questions, and the technical question that I saw was one that I was passingly familiar with, and so I passed the interview. And I guess like ultimately, right, if you can do that, then you can get the job. Like it's spend time practicing that. Go interview with people who actually do interviews. Do as many mock interviews as possible. Do as many real interviews as possible. Go fail them and don't let it get to you. Again, like case for massive failures throughout my entire history. Go fail them, and that's fine. Like, there's a lot of, I remember talking to hack writers as they graduate, and they asked me basically some version of this question. They're like, and they asked me, Mike, how many technical interviews did you fail before landing your first job interview? And I'm a horrible person. I actually like made it on my first one somehow. Like that Presto was the only company that I interviewed for, and so it's absolutely ridiculous. So but I at the same time, like I've watched like really talented engineers fail for 6 months, a year, doing interview after interview after interview. that haven't had that experience. And these are people that like I would look at now and be like, that person is a better programmer than I am. So there really is like this long tail distribution of just odds, and you have to be willing to strike out a bunch of times before you hit something. So my tip on answering technical questions is perseverance.
All right, Mike, do you have time for one more? I know we're kind of at time.
Yeah.
All right, let's see.
Sure.
Okay, so one more about, trying to mix it up a little bit. Is it required to speak Japanese to work at Google's Tokyo office? Does the office hire any APM new grads? Any advice for PM recruiting at Google? And then kind of to pair that up, someone also asked, if you're not a software engineer, what are good opportunities in Japan?
Okay. Are you required to speak Japanese at Google? No, but it will make your life in Japan easier. I recommend learning Japanese if you want to live in the country. If you want to live in Germany, I recommend learning German. If you want to live in France, I recommend learning French. APM recruiting. So my PM is actually an APM, and she is like phenomenally good. I love, like, I'm gonna say this quietly, but I think APMs are better than PMs in general. Like they're closer to the product. They've got their head on the ground. They're like really interested in digging through. People are laughing. They're really interested in digging through like the really tight issues. So I love having APMs. For those that don't know, APM is an associate PM. They're basically really elite fresh grads who come out and want to join Google as a product manager, as they like to, start their career as a PM. There's a lot of opportunities for people who are not software engineering. Like HR is one of them. A lot of the foreigners that I know work in HR one way, shape, or form. There's people who are ancillary, like TPMs, technical program managers. Like if you know your way around software and sort of like, can do project management and understand and can have like a high level. Again, this is sort of like the intersection of business and engineering. Even if you're not like, a fully qualified software engineer, having some technical background and like being able to maximize the product sense will make you really, really valuable, especially have insight into how a product works. So yeah, like in general, yes, but the reliance in any of these fields, right, is going to be sort of at the intersection of some pair of elements, right, that make you special. And so the thing that I want to say is that like in Japan, they have a local market, right? There's like, 120 million Japanese people here who can do, pretty much every job, right? And in order to highlight yourself in a foreign market, it's actually not enough to just be like, oh, I speak Japanese. Like, yeah, there's 120 million Japanese people who speak Japanese. What of it? Not enough. Bringing in some other aspect, whether that's, being able to do like real PM work for overseas, bringing in a diverse opinion about like how to build things and being able to demonstrably do that, right? Or bringing in, I guess, like business acumen from a market that Japanese people aren't necessarily familiar with. This is a funny story. Who knows about the Subaru commercials in like the 90s? I'm getting a lot of puzzled looks. Okay, so in like the 80s and 90s, Subaru ran a bunch of commercials in the United States catered towards the LGBT community. Yeah. So like the stereotypes that lesbians drive Subarus actually came from this set of commercials. And so basically there's a meeting that, yeah, so like if you go back and watch these commercials, they're like really subtle messaging around LGBT. But what ended up happening was it's just a bunch of people looking really happy, like two women in a car driving across country. Fantastic, it sounds happy. And it worked in the United States because, I mean, they were able to sell cars because not only they were appealing to people who, like, the straight people literally didn't pick up on the subtle LGBT signal in it, and the LGBT people who were like, already attuned to picking up on that. They're like, oh yeah, that's for me. I'm gonna go buy a Subaru. And this was a massive success, right? But can you imagine this happening? Is that there was a meeting between US marketing, Subaru US marketing, and Japanese executives, where the US marketing team was trying to explain the meaning of the word gay to a Japanese team. And when the Japanese exec team was looking up the word gay, they're like, oh, happy, okay, whatever, if it works, it sells cars, it sells cars. And they went and had this thing, and there was like no conversation around like what the framing of that was. So yeah, being able to like cross that divide and being able to like understand what that, you know, space in between like different cultures, you know, is really, really the key thing. Like not just being able to speak the language, to be a successful like advocate and be a successful, you know, in whatever it is that you're doing overseas with the group that you're working with. I hope this helps.
Thank you, Mike. I feel like that was such a fun way to end our conversation today. Yeah, it looks like some light bulbs going on about that ad and or their slogan. But really appreciate you starting your day with us, sharing all about your really non-traditional path and how bilingualism has been a common thread throughout there. If any of the students want to follow up, what's the best way to maybe connect with you?
Feel free to send me a LinkedIn invite. If you're going to send me a LinkedIn invite, send me one with a message attached to it saying, hey, I saw you on so-and-so, and I'd love to chat. I welcome that kind of thing. I will probably, if you don't send a message, I will probably reject you. And if you accidentally send one without a message, feel free to just like follow up with a message or like something. But I get a lot of like random LinkedIn invites from like a lot of random people. So please send a message saying that you saw me here and that you wanted to reach out. I'd be happy to take time to chat.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate it. For everybody else, definitely take him up on it. I know he's been an amazing mentor for some other students I've worked with and has stayed in touch with them as well. So hope you enjoyed today's talk. We'll see you all tomorrow for Arsh's Q&A. Joe and James, any other final announcements?
I don't think so. Thank you so much, Mike. Really a really awesome Q&A and presentation. So thank you so much. And I love ending on the Subaru note. But yeah, definitely join us for Arsh's Q&A tomorrow. It's a little bit early for the Pacific folks, but Regina is waking up to co-moderate it with me. So thank you, Regina. Looking forward to seeing you guys there.
Don't forget to fill out the feedback form too, so that we can let Mike know how much we loved or didn't love his. I think most people are going to love it.
All right, thank you so much. It was an honor being here and talking to everybody, and I look forward to hearing about what everybody accomplishes.
Awesome.
Have a great day.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Have a great night.
Bye.
I'm
Thanks,
going to have a
Mike.
great